My beloved child. There are moments when a person enters your story expecting to find an explanation, only to discover a truth they were never prepared to carry. Tonight, imagine one of those moments unfolding quietly, behind a closed door, in a room where your name was spoken with more seriousness than you could ever know. Someone had been looking into your life. Not casually. Not because of simple curiosity. They wanted answers about you, and what they uncovered began changing the way another person saw your entire story. But why would anyone search so deeply into a life that was never theirs to understand? It began with a question your soulmate could not answer. They had been sitting alone long after the rest of the house had gone silent, staring at a message on their phone that they had read so many times the words had almost lost their shape. Someone had contacted them earlier that evening and said, "I found something about them." That sentence should have meant nothing. Instead, your soulmate felt something tighten inside their chest. They asked what it was. There was a long pause. Then came the answer. "I think you misunderstood who they really are." Your soulmate leaned back in the chair, confused. Outside the window, rain tapped softly against the glass, and the room was illuminated only by the pale light of a lamp beside them. They had spent months trying to understand your silence, your distance, the moments when you seemed close and then suddenly unreachable. They had created explanations because people naturally fill empty spaces with stories. But now someone was telling them that the story they had built around you was wrong. And suddenly, they wanted to know what had been discovered. The person who investigated your life had not started with your present. They started with your past. They followed small pieces of information, old conversations, forgotten connections, moments you probably believed nobody remembered. They discovered that some of the things people had assumed about you were based on incomplete stories. Someone had seen you walk away from a situation and assumed you were cold. Someone else had watched you remain silent and decided you did not care. Another person remembered only the moment you said no, never asking what had happened before you said it. But the deeper they looked, the stranger the pattern became. Again and again, your silence had been protecting something. Not a secret that would destroy everything. Something much more human. Pain you had never learned how to explain. The investigator found an old conversation from years earlier. It was brief, almost insignificant, yet it changed the entire direction of their search. In that conversation, someone had asked you why you kept carrying responsibility that did not belong to you. Your answer was simple. Because somebody has to. That sentence stayed with them. Why had you learned to think that way? Why had you become the person who carried things quietly while allowing everyone else to believe you were unaffected? The search continued. They discovered moments when you had helped people without telling anyone. They found evidence of choices you had made that cost you something personally but gave someone else a chance to move forward. None of it looked dramatic from the outside. There were no grand speeches. No audience applauding you. Just ordinary decisions made in private. And that was what made the discovery so powerful. You had not been performing goodness. You had been living it when nobody was watching. Your soulmate did not know any of this. And that realization began to unsettle them. Because suddenly, memories they had with you started changing meaning. They remembered a night when you had seemed distracted while they were talking. At the time, they thought you were uninterested. Now they wondered whether you had been carrying something you didn't want to place on their shoulders. They remembered a conversation where you refused to defend yourself. They had interpreted it as indifference. Now they wondered whether you simply knew that explaining yourself would expose someone else's private struggle. And then your soulmate remembered something else. The way you looked at them before leaving that night. They had almost forgotten it. Almost. There had been something in your eyes that they couldn't name. Not rejection. Not anger. It had been restraint. As if you wanted to say something but had decided they were not ready to hear it. The investigator found another piece of the story shortly afterward. This one was different. It involved a person your soulmate had never expected to be connected to you. A person from an earlier chapter of your life. When the investigator mentioned the name, your soulmate went completely still. Because they knew that person too. And suddenly the entire situation became personal. They asked, "What does this have to do with them?" The investigator hesitated. Then said, "Everything." Your soulmate felt the room become strangely quiet. They wanted to demand an explanation, but something stopped them. Perhaps it was the tone in the other person's voice. Perhaps it was the fact that this search had gone far beyond curiosity. Or perhaps some part of them already sensed that the truth would force them to confront something they had been avoiding. The investigator explained that this person had once told a story about you. But they had left out one crucial detail. A detail that changed who had actually been hurt. Your soulmate listened without interrupting. The story they had believed for so long began falling apart piece by piece. And then came the first real shock. You had not walked away from someone because you stopped caring. You had walked away because staying would have allowed a situation to become more painful for everyone involved. Your soulmate lowered their eyes. They remembered how easily they had judged that decision. How many times they had wondered whether you simply did not love deeply enough. Now they realized they might have been measuring your love by your willingness to stay, when your love had sometimes been expressed through the courage to leave. That thought hit harder than they expected. They stood up and walked toward the window. Rain continued sliding down the glass. For several seconds, they said nothing. Then they whispered, almost to themselves, "Why didn't they ever tell me?" The investigator answered quietly. "Because they didn't want you to love them out of pity." Your soulmate closed their eyes. That sentence opened something inside them. Because it explained 1,000 little things. The moments when you changed the subject. The times you smiled when something clearly hurt. The way you insisted you were fine even when your voice became softer. The distance. The restraint. The strange habit of giving people an easy exit whenever you cared about them. Your soulmate suddenly understood that they had mistaken your self-protection for emotional distance. But the investigation was not finished. There was one final piece of information the investigator had been reluctant to reveal. They said they had found something that happened shortly before you met your soulmate. Something that involved a decision you made in complete secrecy. Your soulmate asked what decision. No answer came immediately. Instead, the investigator sent a photograph. Your soulmate opened it. Their expression changed. They stared at the screen for several seconds without blinking. Because the photograph showed you standing somewhere your soulmate recognized. A place connected to a moment they had always believed belonged only to them. But you were there before they ever knew you. And suddenly, a question rose in their mind that made every other question feel small. How could you have been there? They looked again. Then they noticed the date. Their hands began trembling slightly. It was taken before the two of you had ever met. Before your first conversation. Before the first message. Before either of you knew the other's name. And yet there you were. Standing in the exact place where, years later, your soulmate would make one of the most important decisions of their life. Your soulmate slowly sat back down. The room felt different now. This was no longer about discovering whether you had hidden something. It was about understanding why two lives that seemed to move separately had crossed paths with such strange precision. They looked at the photograph one more time. Then the investigator sent one final message. I didn't find this by accident. Your soulmate stared at those words. What do you mean? The reply appeared almost immediately. I found out who brought them there. Your soulmate's breath caught. Because the name that appeared beneath that sentence was not a stranger. It was someone they had trusted. Someone who had known about your life long before your soulmate ever realized you existed. And beneath the name was one more sentence. They've been keeping the real reason from both of you. Your soulmate stopped breathing for a moment. The rain outside seemed louder. The phone remained glowing in their hand. And for the first time, they understood that the person who had been searching through your life may not have been looking for evidence against you at all. They may have been trying to uncover the reason your paths were brought together in the first place. But there was still one question nobody had answered. Why had someone gone to such extraordinary lengths to hide that truth? And more importantly, what had they discovered about you that could make your soulmate look at their entire relationship differently? Your soulmate stared at your name on their screen. Their finger hovered over it. They almost called. Almost. Then another message arrived. Just 6 words. I know what you sacrificed for them. Your soulmate froze. Because there was only one person in the world who could possibly know what that sacrifice was. And that person had been silent for years. Until tonight. My beloved child. The message remained on the screen long after your soulmate stopped reading it. I know what you sacrificed for them. 6 words. Yet somehow, those 6 words carried the weight of years. Your soulmate stared at them, trying to understand how a stranger could know something they had never even suspected. Their first instinct was to call you, but their hand stopped before touching your name. What if calling you now forced open a door you had spent years keeping closed? What if the truth they were about to discover was not something you wanted them to know? Then another message appeared. Ask about the night you disappeared. Your soulmate's face changed. There had been a night. One they had always remembered differently. Years ago, before the two of you truly understood what was happening between you, there had been a period when you suddenly became unreachable. Messages went unanswered. Calls were returned late. When you finally appeared again, you acted as though nothing unusual had happened. Your soulmate had asked you where you were. You smiled. Just dealing with something. They had accepted the answer. Now they wondered why they had never asked again. The investigator sent a location. Your soulmate recognized it immediately. An old building on the edge of town. A place that had once been nearly empty, surrounded by aging trees and cracked sidewalks. They remembered passing it years earlier without knowing why it felt strangely familiar. The investigator wrote, "Go there tomorrow morning." Your soulmate almost laughed. This is ridiculous. But the next sentence erased the humor. Because that's where the sacrifice happened. They didn't sleep that night. Morning arrived slowly, gray sunlight spreading across the bedroom floor. Your soulmate drove through quiet streets with both hands gripping the steering wheel, carrying a question that had become heavier with every mile. When they finally arrived, the building looked smaller than they remembered. There was an old metal gate. A faded sign. A narrow hallway beyond the entrance. Nothing about it appeared extraordinary. Until they saw the room number. Their expression changed. It was the same number written on an old piece of paper you had once kept tucked inside a book. They had seen it years ago. They had asked what it meant. You had immediately closed the book. Nothing important. But it had been important. Very important. Your soulmate entered the building. An elderly caretaker was sitting behind a small desk near the entrance. When your soulmate mentioned your name, the man's expression softened with recognition. You know them? The caretaker nodded. Not recently. Then he studied your soulmate's face. You must be the person they were waiting for. Your soulmate felt their heart stop. Waiting for? The caretaker seemed surprised. They never told you? No. The old man looked toward the hallway. Then he reached beneath the desk and pulled out a small envelope. It was worn around the edges. Your name was written across the front. Your soulmate stared at it. When was this written? The caretaker answered, a long time ago. Their fingers trembled as they accepted it. There was no dramatic revelation inside. No confession. Only a handwritten sentence. If they ever come looking for me, give them this. Your soulmate swallowed. Who are they? The caretaker didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the final door in the hallway. That's where they Saturday. Your soulmate walked toward it. Every step seemed to pull them deeper into a past they had never known existed. Inside was a small room containing an old wooden table and 2 chairs. One chair faced the window. The other faced the door. The caretaker remained outside. Your soulmate sat down. And then they noticed something carved into the table. 2 initials. Yours. And theirs. They stood abruptly. This was impossible. Those initials had been carved years before the 2 of you ever met. At least, that was what they believed. Then the caretaker spoke from the doorway. They didn't carve those. Your soulmate turned. Who did? The old man's answer was quiet. They asked someone else to. The room became completely still. Why? Because they wanted to leave something behind. What? The caretaker looked at the envelope. A reminder. Your soulmate opened it again. There was something folded inside. A photograph. Not of you. Not of them. It showed 3 people standing outside the building. One was the person your soulmate had trusted. Another was someone from your past. And the third person was someone your soulmate recognized instantly. Their own family member. The photograph slipped from their fingers. For years, they had believed certain events in their life happened naturally. Now they were looking at evidence that people around them had known far more than they had ever admitted. Your soulmate picked up the photograph. When was this taken? The caretaker gave them a date. Your soulmate calculated the years silently. Then their eyes widened. It had been taken only weeks before you entered their life. Someone had known you. Someone had known them. And someone had been preparing for their paths to cross. But why? The caretaker finally revealed what had happened that night. You had come to the building carrying a bag. You had looked exhausted. Not physically broken. Emotionally finished. You had been offered an opportunity to leave everything behind. A new city. A new beginning. No explanations. No old memories. No painful attachments. And you had almost accepted. Your soulmate listened in silence. Then came the part that changed everything. You had asked one question. Will they be okay if I leave? The caretaker remembered your exact words. You weren't asking about yourself. You were asking about someone else. A person your soulmate had never heard about. Someone whose life depended, at least in part, on the decision you were about to make. You chose to stay. Not because you were afraid to begin again. Because someone else needed you. And that choice cost you an opportunity you never told anyone about. Your soulmate covered their mouth. They suddenly understood something painful. There had been a version of your life where you might have become a completely different person. You could have left. You could have started somewhere else. You could have avoided years of confusion, disappointment, and emotional exhaustion. But you stayed. And because you stayed, your life eventually crossed paths with theirs. The investigator had not discovered a scandal. They had discovered a sacrifice. But there was still something missing. Who had been the person you stayed for? The caretaker hesitated when your soulmate asked. Then he gave them a name. Your soulmate recognized it. Their stomach dropped. Because that person was connected to the one event in their own past they had never fully understood. A decision made by their family. A decision that had changed the direction of their life. Suddenly, the pieces began forming a picture. Your sacrifice had protected someone connected to them. That person's survival had altered their future. And somehow, years later, that chain of events had brought you and your soulmate together. But the story became even more complicated when the investigator called. Their voice was different this time. No longer calm. No longer analytical. They sounded shaken. I found the original record. Your soulmate asked, what record? The one that proves this wasn't coincidence. Silence. Then. There's a name on it. Whose? The investigator took a breath. Yours. Your soulmate's heart began racing. That doesn't make sense. I know. What does it say? Another pause. Then the investigator said something that made the entire room seem to tilt. It says someone asked them to protect you before you ever met. Your soulmate couldn't speak. Someone had anticipated a future neither of you could see. Someone had placed a request years before your first conversation. And suddenly, the old photograph, the hidden room, your unexplained sacrifice, and the strange timing of your meeting were no longer separate pieces. They belonged to the same story. But there was one detail the investigator still hadn't revealed. They had found the person who made the request. Your soulmate whispered, "Who?" The investigator answered. "I think you already know." Your soulmate stared at the photograph again. 3 people. 1 family secret. 1 sacrifice. And a decision made before your love story had even begun. Then they noticed something on the back of the photograph. A handwritten date. And underneath it, a sentence. If they ever fall in love, don't tell them why. Your soulmate's eyes filled with tears. Because suddenly they understood the cruelest possibility of all. Maybe your relationship had not been built on a secret you were hiding. Maybe it had been built around a truth everyone else had agreed to hide from you. And if that was true, then the person who had spent years protecting the secret was still alive. Still watching. Still silent. Until now. The investigator sent one final photograph. Your soulmate opened it. Their breath disappeared. It was a recent picture. Not an old photograph. Not evidence from years ago. A picture taken only days earlier. And standing in the background was the one person your soulmate had never expected to see again. The person who knew the entire truth. The person who had been present before your paths crossed. The person who could finally explain why you sacrificed everything without ever telling them. Then your soulmate noticed where the photograph had been taken. Your home. And suddenly, they realized someone had not merely been investigating your past. Someone had been watching the story continue. And they had left one final message beneath the photograph. Tomorrow, they will finally tell you why. But your soulmate didn't know that tomorrow would bring a revelation neither of you could undo. My beloved child. Tomorrow did come. But it did not arrive with thunder, dramatic footsteps, or some impossible sign in the sky. It arrived quietly, through the soft gray light of morning and the sound of a knock against your soulmate's door. 3 knocks. Measured. Unhurried. Your soulmate stood still for several seconds. They already knew who was standing on the other side. When the door opened, the person from the photograph was there. Older now. Their face carried the unmistakable weight of someone who had spent years rehearsing a confession they never found the courage to make. Your soulmate stepped aside. Neither spoke. The visitor entered and placed a small box on the table. I should have given this to you years ago. Your soulmate looked at the box. Why didn't you? The visitor lowered their eyes. Because I made a promise. To whom? To them. Your soulmate's voice softened. What did they ask you to promise? The visitor finally looked up. They asked me to let you believe they walked away because they didn't care. Those words landed differently than everything that had come before. Because now the silence had a reason. The distance had a reason. The unanswered questions had a reason. And suddenly, your soulmate understood that you had not been hiding the truth because you wanted control over the story. You had hidden it because you believed telling it would change the way you were loved. The visitor opened the box. Inside was a collection of letters. Some were old. Some had never been delivered. Your soulmate recognized your handwriting immediately. The first letter began with a sentence that made their eyes fill with tears. I hope you never have to know what I gave up to make sure you could keep moving forward. They stopped reading. They couldn't continue. The visitor quietly explained everything. Years before you met your soulmate, someone close to them had fallen into a difficult situation. A decision had to be made, and your involvement could have exposed something painful that would have affected their future. You had discovered the truth. You had been given a choice. Tell everyone and protect yourself. Or remain silent and protect someone who could not protect themselves. You chose silence. But that silence cost you. An opportunity disappeared. A relationship ended. A future you had once imagined quietly closed its doors. And still, you never told your soulmate. Not because you were ashamed. Because you didn't want gratitude to become the foundation of your connection. You wanted to be loved for who you were, not for what you had endured. Your soulmate wiped away a tear. So they knew? The visitor nodded. They knew everything. Then why did they let me misunderstand? The visitor looked toward the window. Because they were afraid that if you knew what they had sacrificed, you'd spend the rest of your life trying to repay them. Silence filled the room. And suddenly, your soulmate understood something deeper. Real love does not always announce itself. Sometimes it makes a difficult choice, steps away from recognition, and accepts being misunderstood so another person's future can remain untouched. That did not make the pain disappear. But it finally gave the pain meaning. Then the visitor handed over the final letter. This one was written after you met. Your soulmate hesitated. They opened it. The first line was simple. I think I've met the person I was trying to protect. Your soulmate stopped breathing. They read the sentence again. Then again. The rest of the letter explained that after everything you had sacrificed, life had brought you directly toward the very person whose future you had once tried to preserve. You had not known the full connection. You had not planned it. You had simply met someone who made you feel something you had spent years trying not to need. And that person was your soulmate. Your soulmate lowered the letter. For the first time, the mystery no longer felt frightening. It felt almost sacred. Not because some perfect destiny had removed every difficulty from your lives. But because two people had somehow found each other after walking through completely different storms. The visitor spoke again. There is one more thing. Your soulmate looked up. What? They never wanted you to know about the sacrifice. Then why tell me now? Because they don't need to carry it alone anymore. That sentence changed everything. Your soulmate stood. They finally understood that the investigation had never been about exposing you. It had been about uncovering the truth beneath years of assumptions. Someone had looked into your life expecting to find something hidden. Instead, they found evidence of a heart that had repeatedly chosen compassion when nobody was applauding. They found someone who had learned to survive without demanding to be understood. They found a person who had quietly protected others while carrying their own unanswered questions. And your soulmate finally saw you clearly. Not as the person they had once feared would leave. Not as the mysterious figure they had tried to decode. Not as someone whose silence needed to be punished with suspicion. But as a human being who had been doing their best with a heart that had been asked to carry too much. Your soulmate picked up the phone. This time, they called. You answered. Neither of you spoke immediately. There was a long silence. Then your soulmate whispered your name. You knew from their voice that something had changed. What happened? They took a breath. I know. You became quiet. You know what? The truth. Another silence. You could have denied it. You could have changed the subject. You could have protected the secret one more time. Instead, you finally said, I didn't want you to love me because of it. Your soulmate closed their eyes. I don't. You waited. I love you because of who you became while nobody was watching. Those words broke through the last wall. For years, you had believed that being understood meant exposing every wound, explaining every decision, proving every intention. But perhaps understanding could also arrive gently. Perhaps the right person did not need every chapter rewritten. Perhaps they simply needed the courage to read the pages they had once misunderstood. Your soulmate continued. You don't have to protect me from your truth anymore. And that was the moment something inside you finally became still. Not because every difficult memory vanished. Not because the past suddenly became beautiful. But because you no longer had to carry it alone. The person who had spent years guarding the secret eventually apologized. Not with excuses. Not with dramatic promises. Just an honest admission. I thought silence would protect you both. Your soulmate answered. It protected us from the truth. It didn't protect us from the pain. The visitor nodded. And perhaps that was the final lesson hidden inside the entire story. Sometimes people keep secrets because they believe they are protecting love. But love does not become stronger through permanent silence. It becomes stronger when truth can finally be spoken without punishment. When the past can be acknowledged without becoming the future. When two people can look at what happened and choose not to let it define what happens next. Later that evening, your soulmate came to see you. There was no dramatic speech waiting. No perfect explanation. You simply sat together. For a while, neither of you said anything. Then your soulmate reached for your hand. You looked down. They squeezed gently. You don't have to explain everything tonight. You looked at them. Then what do we do? They smiled through tears. We start being honest tomorrow. And somehow, that was more beautiful than any grand promise. Because the future did not need to be guaranteed. It only needed to be chosen. Again and again. By two people who now understood what had once been hidden from them. The investigation had begun with someone looking into your life. It ended with your soulmate looking into your heart. And what they discovered left them speechless for an entirely different reason. They discovered that beneath the silence was love. Beneath the distance was protection. Beneath the difficult choices was courage. And beneath all those years of misunderstanding was a person who had never stopped hoping that one day, someone would finally see the difference between being distant and being afraid to burden the person you love. Your story did not end when the truth came out. That was the beautiful part. The truth simply gave the story a new beginning. You no longer had to be the strongest person in every room. You no longer had to hide every sacrifice behind a smile. You no longer had to make yourself smaller so someone else could feel safe. And your soulmate no longer had to guess what your silence meant. From that day forward, when something hurt, you spoke. When something frightened you, you admitted it. When you needed each other, you reached instead of retreating. The past remained part of your story. But it stopped being the author. And perhaps that is what healing really looks like. Not forgetting what happened. Not pretending it never hurt. But finally reaching the place where the truth can exist without controlling your future. So if this fictional story found a quiet place inside your heart, let its message remain with you tonight. You do not have to earn love through sacrifice. You do not have to disappear to protect someone. You do not have to hide every difficult chapter to deserve a beautiful ending. The people meant to walk beside you will not only celebrate your light. They will learn how to sit beside you when the room becomes dark. May you be blessed with relationships where honesty feels safe, where your heart does not have to perform for acceptance, and where the love you give is returned with tenderness and understanding. May the chapters you once feared become reminders of how far you have come. May every misunderstanding that can be healed find its way toward truth. And may the next chapter of your life require less hiding, less carrying, and more simply being loved for exactly who you are. If this story touched something within you, stay connected to this channel, share it with someone who may need its message, and subscribe for more cinematic stories of love, hope, faith, and the hidden truths that can change everything. And remember this as you leave. Sometimes the greatest discovery is not what someone finds when they look into your past. It is what they finally see when they look into your heart.